Hi, my name is Helen Handler, Rifkin, Chorney. I was born in Omaha, Nebraska on November 21st, 1929. My parents were Margaret Chandran Handler and Philip Handler. My father's parents were Ben and Dora Handler. My grandfather Ben Handler had a haberdashery in South Omaha, and he was influential in bringing to this country dear cousins now that I am so grateful that he did bring to this country through Hyas, the Belcher family. I believe there were 4 sisters and 1 brother. My grandmother, Dora Handler, was born Dora Chaikin in Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm probably very unusual in that I was born in this country. My mother and father were both born in Omaha, Nebraska, and my grandmother was born in Omaha, Nebraska. Her maiden name was Chaikin. Her father was a man named Pincus Chaikin, and he was a very pious man who I understand gave the $100 that was necessary to purchase the land at which Golden Hill Cemetery is located. My mother's family were from Hungary. Her maiden name was Chandran. My grandmother was Cohen. She was the oldest of 10 children. One of her brothers was Ben Kahn, who was an electrician in Omaha and quite well known, and another was Adolph Cohn, who was the father of Pauline Handelman and Ruth Orch, and 2 other siblings. There were 10 other children, and I find this to be a very great interest to me was that through the Historical Society's video program, which we're enjoying now, I watched a tape of Lois Friedman. And in that tape, she relayed her history and her mother's family. And she was naming all of her uncles and aunts and was talking about her mother's youngest brother, whose name was David Gross, and that he had been a doctor and had died at a very young age. And I'm watching this and I'm thinking, that strikes an awfully familiar note to me, because my grandmother's youngest sister was married to a young man named David Gross, who had been a doctor and died at a very young age. So I immediately got on the phone and called Lois, and now I have another cousin. So this is a wonderful thing that I think that we're enjoying from all of this. Now, I was raised at 2509 North 19th Street, or as I like to say, Florence Boulevard, because Florence Boulevard started at Lake Street. South of that, it was 19th Street. Along 19th Street, there were so many Jewish families, I can hardly even remember all of their names now, but I had a very dear friend. Her name was Elaine Whiteman. She lived down that street. The Bernsteins lived on that street. The Nepomniaks lived on that street. I could go on. And on 16th Street was my very dearest friend, Lorraine Gorelick Passman. And then there was Riva Cohn-Savalsky, who lived on 17th and Lake, and another dear friend, Betty Gilman Harris, who lived on 18th and Lake. And as kids did in those days, we would all be together all afternoon, and then we'd walk each other home, and then we'd walk each other back home again, and then back home again, and finally we all got to our own homes, and then immediately got on the phone so that we could talk to each other. And naturally heard our mothers say, "You were with them all afternoon, what else do you have to say?" But the wonderful part of it is that my friends from those very, very early days Annie Schragle Belmont, who probably was my first friend, and that was when I was probably not even in kindergarten yet. And these are friends to this day. These are my dearest friends, and I cherish all of them. I went to I went to Lake School and graduated from Lake School in, I think it was 1943, January. And I went to Central High, and I graduated from Central High at the age of 16 in 1946. Now, why I wanted to graduate a half a year early, I don't know, except that in those days we sort of either went a half a year longer or a half a year shorter, and since I was able to get out a half a year early, I did. Then I had a wonderful opportunity to work with Rabbi Moshewitz, who was the head rabbi of the Orthodox synagogue that we attended. And his offices were in the Jewish Community Center, which was right across the street from the JCC. I worked for him for about a year, and in the meantime, in that year, I was attending some night classes at University of Omaha, or at Omaha U as it was called in those days. I had met my first husband, Ben Rifkin, when we had our high school graduation dinner. And his younger brother, Paul, or Paish, as most Omahans remember him, was my very close friend, Phyllis Kirschenbaum's boyfriend. And Ben was just home from the service after having served in the Army. And Paish brought him with him to this dance. And I met him briefly, but I thought he was pretty cute. And but since I was 16 and he was 21, it didn't look as if our paths were going to cross too quickly. But later that summer, as I was working at the JCC for Rabbi, I was standing on the corner of 15th and Dodge, and a good friend, Marv Gerber, was also standing there, and along came this cute guy, Ben Rifkin, and we were introduced. And fast forward 2 years later, we were married. So I guess the 5 years really wasn't as much of an issue as I thought it might be. Ben was going to school at the University of Omaha, and I was working, and we were married, and then in 1950 our oldest child was born. He had graduated now and was working for Al Mayer at Grace Mayer Insurance Company. And then he went on, eventually, his very dearest friend, Al Nepomnic, and another friend, Marv Gerber, were working at Midwest Heater Company, and told him that there was something there that they thought he'd be good at, and so he went to work for them, or with them for some time, and then eventually found his way back into the insurance company, and eventually became a partner in R.D. Marcotte Insurance, and worked there until he retired in 1987.
I want to hear about the courtship with Ben and Alan.
With Ben and
Helen.
And Helen. Okay, the courtship.
Before you got married.
Okay. Well, as I say, I thought he was pretty cute, and I guess most people do recognize that when a girl, even if she's 16, when she sets her sights on someone, as Ben used to say, you get chased until you get caught. And I guess that might have been part of the case, but we we were, as most people were in those days, didn't have a car, so when he came home from service, he would drive his dad's car, and that's how we courted, either with his dad's car or the street car. And sometimes he would leave my house at a late hour and have to walk up to 16th Street to catch the streetcar back to his home where he lived on 28th and Leavenworth. And we started dating in 1940, well, actually, in March of 1947. And we went with a number of his friends who were, again, Al Nepomnic, Marv Gerber, Shimmy, and Yuzzy, or Sam and Rose Cohn, but they were better known as Shim and Yuzzy Cohn. And we would go to places like the Music Box to dance. We'd go to movies. We'd go bowling and do a lot of picnics. We did a lot of things that didn't cost a lot of money because nobody had any money. And so we were quite content to just be in each other's company, and we would have potluck dinners together. This was when we were young newlyweds, of course. But prior to that, that was mainly our courtship. We got engaged on my 18th birthday, and we were married on March 21st, 1948.
Tell me about the wedding.
We were married at the Paxton Hotel. It was a 6 o'clock wedding, and I was as calm as could be. And Ben was, I understand, so nervous that when I saw pictures of him afterwards coming down the aisle, it was pretty bad. I almost felt sorry for him. I think he was probably far more nervous than I was. I guess that I knew what I was doing all along, and he had to learn. But we had the Sheva Bruchas at the Paxton Hotel, and then afterwards we were at home and had a dinner at home because, again, in those days, this was just after the war. And apartments were very, very difficult to come by. There was very little housing because so many young men were coming back and starting a new life. And Ben's father, and my father-in-law was Harry Rifkin, and his mother was Mary Rifkin. He had some apartment complexes or some properties, and God love him, but he said, well, we'll just make room for you. So he had to have evicted somebody, and now I feel badly about it, but at the time I was very, very grateful. Otherwise we would have lived with parents because that's, again, what you did in those days. How far do you want me to go with?
I want to hear about some of the people that were involved in the wedding with you. And with Ben.
Okay. My bridesmaids were my very dearest friends, Lorraine Gorelick and Betty Gilman, my two sisters, and I've neglected to mention long before this that I had two sisters. My sister Betty, who was 3 years younger than I, and my sister Laura Lee, who was 5 years younger. Annie Schrago was she did the autograph book, or whatever you call it, the book that people sign when they come to give you good wishes. And Ben's groomsmen were Mark Gerber, Al Nepomnic, Shimmy Cohn. His brother Paish was his best man. Oh yes, Phyllis Rifkin was also in my wedding party because she and Paish were now engaged to be married as well. Mort Fisher, and I believe those were his groomsmen. After Ben and I were married, our first apartment that was was made available for us was at 620 South 28th Street. And it was a living room, a great big kitchen, and a bedroom that only held the bed, and a very small dresser. And there was a door that led to a balcony, and in order to open the door, you had to climb over the bed, and the door opened about 6 inches. And then there was a window behind the bed that you couldn't open, so you can imagine how much fresh air without air conditioning there was. But in 1948, if you had an oscillating fan that just sort of moved back and forth and moved some air around, you considered yourself lucky. Ben's parents lived down the street, closer to Leavenworth, in a little duplex. And eventually, when I was expecting David, my first son, half of the duplex was made available for us to move into with our expanding family. I want to go back a little bit to some of the aunts and uncles who were a very big part of my life when I was growing up, because in those days, most of your social life was spent with family. And almost everyone had an aunt or an uncle or somebody who lived down the block or across the street or somewhere. And we had an Aunt Fanny and Rothman, who lived in Council Bluffs. And she would come over every Sunday to visit her sister, my grandmother, who lived with us. My grandmother, Rose Schonbrunn, my mother's mother, lived with us all of my life. I never knew my life as a child until I married without my grandma, who was a very, very special woman in my life. She influenced me a great deal.
Tell me something about her. Tell me
My
some
grandma?
more. Yes.
She was an amazing lady. She had 2 children. My mother was the oldest, and then another daughter, my Aunt Goldie, and she married my Uncle Ben Elkin. His family was also from Omaha and eventually had moved to Denver. The girls were very, very close. And my grandfather, I understand, died when my aunt was very young, maybe less than 5. And so she came to live with my family, and I still remember when my Aunt Goldie got married. I was 4, and she was probably 22. I think she was 18 years older than I was. And but I do have memories of that wedding. My great-grandparents, my grandmother, Schonbrunn's mother and father, lived in a little yellow house on 17th Street, and I don't know exactly what street was the crossing street, but it was a little yellow house right across the street from the Strelo Court, and which is, I think, still there today, probably. That was where, and that was where my aunt and uncle were married. And in days gone by, if you were religious, and ours was an Orthodox family, you were rarely married in a synagogue. You usually were married in a hotel or in a home. And that's where receptions were held and Sheva Brachos were held, and it was very close and very family-oriented. And children were always part of it. My great-grandparents, who spoke mostly Hungarian. I'm one of the few people who probably wasn't raised in a home in which Yiddish was the primary language spoken, because my mother father were both born in Omaha, they naturally spoke English because they were educated here. But if any other language were spoken, and as most people know, when another language is spoken in the house so the kids don't understand what you're saying, it was Hungarian. And I had my grandmother, again back to my Grandma Schambron. She was a wonderful seamstress, and I think she probably helped raise her children by sewing. She could sew anything. In fact, I told this to one of my granddaughters recently. When I was young, she made almost all of my clothes, and she never used a pattern. And when I was married, and you're looking for a trousseau, I would tell my grandma that I saw a dress in Brandeis' window, and she'd go look at it, and then she'd find some fabric that looked like the fabric, and then she'd make her own pattern out of paper sacks, probably, or she'd just pin it up to my shoulders, and within a couple of days I would have that dress that was in Brandeis' window. So if she were today's young woman, she'd be an entrepreneur, and she'd probably be on a famous television star because she was an amazing person. She was a marvelous cook, and she loved cooking for people, so it didn't matter to her how many people you brought home. She'd always find something. She could make one chicken into a meal for at least 12 people. She'd make it in one chicken in about 6 different ways, and everything was always good. Where do you want me to go?
I want to hear about Ben.
I want to hear about Ben. Well, Ben was 5 years older than I, and probably my mother would never have consented to my marrying at the age of at barely 18, except that he was what he was all of his life, which was a truly kind and caring person. She knew that he would take good care of me, and he did. And he dearly loved his sons. He was thrilled to death when each son was born. And he was a man of great wisdom, and I think that his sons recognize that. And to this day, they will tell you, Dad said this or Dad said that, because his words were always things that they truly took to heart. And when he became ill, which was in 1997, he retired in 1987. I'm going to digress just for a minute, okay? I had not worked since 1949. I was the typical stay-at-home mom. And then in 1985, I believe, my good friend Marcia Lipsman, who was working as a part-time helper in the Cultural Arts Department at the J, was going abroad on a long trip. And my daughter-in-law, Karen, who was the president of the Cultural Arts Committee, suggested that I talk to Ann Kibble-Schwartz about filling in for her. So I thought, no, I haven't done anything in so many years, I don't know what I could do, but I did it. And the next thing I knew, I was working as a part-time temporary for Ann, and the next thing I knew, she was leaving, and I was suddenly the person left in the office to carry on with the Cultural Arts Department. And the next thing you knew, Marcia wasn't coming back, so now I was not only part-time permanent, but now 6 months later, I was hired as a sort of a intermediate cultural arts director, which which I did for about 6 months. And I stayed on at the J for probably another 6 years. And I had a wonderful time because it wasn't really a job. I was allowed to do a lot of things. And of course, Ben had already, well, he retired in 1987 for health reasons mostly, and because he was, we felt it was time that we just start relaxing and doing some of the fun things. And I was having a fun time at my job, and he was loving every minute of it because he was sort of my unpaid helper. And those were some very good years. He became ill in 1997, and he passed on in the year 2000. He's still sorely missed by all of us who loved him. I was alone then for 3 years, and Dave Chorney, who also had lived on North 19th Street, whose family lived on North 19th Street, and whose sister Shirley went to school with me, and whose sister Tilly went to school with my sister Betty. Dave and his wife Ruth had been neighbors of ours, and of course he had been a dear friend for many years, and we'd known each other, and he and Ben had been very close friends when they were younger and played basketball at the J together, and went to UNO together, and we just started seeing each other. And he is a kind and a dear man who had been alone for some years. Ruth had passed away in 1990, I believe. And the next thing I knew, I'm married. We decided that we would get married, which we did in November of 2003, and he has 3 daughters, and they all live away, and I have 3 sons, so we sort of called ourselves the Brady's, the Brady's Plus.
I want to hear about your sisters, Betty and Laura Lee.
Well, I had 2 gorgeous sisters. They were special. Betty was 3 years younger than I, and Laura Lee 5 years. Laura Lee had been quite ill. She was a diabetic from a very young age. And she had the most beautiful smile and the most beautiful dimples and the most beautiful sparkling brown eyes, and everyone loved her because she had a beautiful singing voice, and she used to love to sing. Had no qualms at all about singing at the drop of a hat. She was the most wonderful aunt to my children. They adored her. Unfortunately, she had been ill for so long. She lost her husband at a very young age, and from the time she lost him, her health suffered even more. She had 2 sons, both of whom came to live with us after she passed on. She was a beautiful woman, and Betty too. Betty lived in California. Betty moved away. This was always sort of a sore point with me, because when I had gotten out of high school at 16, I told my mother that I wanted to move to California and live with my aunt and uncle and go to school in California. And she said, no, 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 you can't go that far away. I'm not going to let any kid of mine go all that far away. I couldn't even go to Kansas City to go to art school. She wouldn't let me go out. But when Betty graduated at 17, and Betty was going to go to live in Chicago with her girlfriend, Rosalie Phillips Meaches, that was okay. But then Rosalie got married, and so Betty decided that she was going to go to California, and away she went. And Betty lived in California all of the years until she passed away 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago. She too had been very ill with diabetes, and I miss her dreadfully. She was very, very near and dear, and that's life. I'm going to talk about my high school years. I loved high school. I really did. I really loved classes. Not all of them. I hated gym, and I really wasn't very good at math, and so I was usually in one of the lower math classes. But I loved English, and I loved history, and I loved civics and other classes. So I did love high school, and I had all of my friends there, and that's what makes school better in between classes, is because you're spending all your time with your friends. My friends when I first went to high school were, again, all my girlfriends from Lake School, Annie and Lorraine and Betty and Reva and Phyllis, who was not part of my neighborhood, but Phyllis and I had known each other when we were even younger, and we went to Hebrew school and to Sunday school at the Omaha Community Sunday School and Hebrew school at the JCC. And I also met Jerry Yowitz Trachtenberg there then too, when I was probably about 10 years old. But we were all good friends in high school. And we also had naturally we had some boyfriends too. We had a lot of boyfriends because, but we were a group. We didn't single each other out individually particularly. We were a large group of friends. There was Joey Frank, my dear, dear friend, who just recently passed away, and Max Gendelman, and Steve Lustgarten, and Danny Epstein, and I'm sure there were probably more, but those are the ones that I particularly remember. But they were only in school for maybe they were a year ahead of me at that time. So when they left Central, most of them went into the service. My now brother-in-law Paish went into the service. I know the rest of the boys all went into the service as well. So my girlfriends and I were inseparable. When we were in school or after school, we would go over to the J. Naturally, everybody went to the J. If there were boys to dance with downstairs at the canteen, we danced with each other because that's, again, something that was not frowned on in those days. You jitterbugged and you had fun. And that's where we spent our time, naturally, after school. It was at the J downstairs at the canteen. A lot of us had gone to work because during the war, most of the older girls had gone to work at the bomber plant, where they were able to make a lot more money than they could selling something. And my mother was the manager of a store called Robinson's. It was a ladies' store on 16th and right next door to Borsheim, where the old Borsheim's was. And she had to hire a lot of young girls to work in place of the older girls who had left. So all my friends went to work for my mother, usually on Monday night when the stores were open and on Saturdays. So I was working from the time I was 14, and all of my friends were as well. This was not an unheard of thing at all. In fact, if you didn't have a job, I don't know what you did with your time. Everyone else was working. Uh, we went swimming at Peony Park in the summertime, all of us. We went bowling at the Music Box, which was just a block east of Central High. We rolled bandages at the Red Cross, which was in the old Union Pacific building. We filled our times completely between school and homework and all of the above. We filled our time, and I wouldn't have given up 1 minute of all of those days. It was a wonderful time of life for me. During the summer, we would get summer jobs if it wasn't in a clothing store or something. By that time, the war was already over. It was 1945, and the war was over. And I had a job one summer, the summer that I was between my junior and senior year in high school. I had a job working behind the counter at Stepanek Cleaners on 24th and I think it was Douglas, 24th and Douglas. And my friend Louise Bolker, who later married Meyer Halprin, had a job at Kimball Laundry, which was on about 22nd Street and Harney. And we would meet for lunch at a drugstore on 24th and Farnham, or at the Harkert's house, and the aromas and the fragrance that came from the Harkert houses, you can't describe. It's just something you had to have seen and known. But I worked there for that summer, and I guess I never appreciated the value of air-conditioned work as much as I did after that summer. It was working downstairs, but upstairs was the laundry, and of course no air conditioning. Don't forget this was 1945, and so it was hot, and we enjoyed, naturally, the only thing that we could enjoy, it was air conditioned, were the theaters. So we used to go to a lot of movies. Well, everybody went to a lot of movies in those days. There was no television. We had great fun. Even the menial jobs that we had, I think my job paid something, I think it was 15 cents an hour. But I want to tell you, I saved money. Because when I brought my paycheck home, I turned it over to my grandmother, who saved it for me until I was ready to go back to school, and I had a fortune, probably about $50, to buy a wardrobe to go back to school. So you learn two things: that it's nice to be in a cool place when it's 100 degrees outside and probably 150 degrees above where you're working, and also that if you save your money, you might have a little money to buy a wardrobe that you wouldn't otherwise have maybe had.
Do you have memories of going to the Jewish Community Center after school?
Every single night, every night. In fact, I think that it was a home away from home for every Jewish kid who went to Central High, and maybe kids who even came from other schools just so that they could be with their Jewish friends at the J. They had what they called a canteen downstairs in the basement, actually. I think that the gym was along a hallway somewhere off, adjacent to it somewhere, but there was a fella whose name was Smitty, and he used to sell hot dogs and ice cream. Now, this was a Jewish community center, and now that I think about it, hot dogs and ice cream, I don't think that would have been allowed in the Jewish community center that we have now at a later date. But we were there every night. We went there to meet our friends. We went there to watch the boys play basketball. In fact, when Ben and I were courting, that was one of the things we did every single Sunday. Every Sunday we were at the J watching the guys play basketball, and then afterwards we would walk down 20th Street to the Dixie Cream donut shop and have coffee and donuts, and then we would go to the Paramount Theater and watch a movie, and then take the streetcar back home again. So the J played an enormous part in all of our lives. If your parents couldn't find you anywhere else, they always knew that all they had to do was call the J. And by the way, my grandmother Handler worked at the J behind the desk for many years after my grandfather died. Paul Verrett, who was the director, not only the Federation director, but he was also the JCC director. He was a good friend of my grandmother's, and he told her that he could use her behind the desk at the J as a receptionist. And so probably at the age of 70 or something, she probably went to work there. And all the kids in Omaha knew her. And they would call Mrs. Handler to find out, to say, when you see my kid, tell him that he's got to come home now. So they always knew where to find you if you weren't at home. Without cars, you weren't going to get into too many predicaments when you were 15 and 14 and even 16 or 17 years of age. First of all, there weren't a lot of cars around at that time. Secondly, if it was wartime, there wasn't gas to drive the cars. So you were either at home, or you were at a friend's house, or you were at the J. And I think it made life a lot easier on parents than it probably has been ever since. I'd like to close this by saying that I have been blessed with 3 wonderful sons who have been my mainstay through my whole life, really, since they have been born. My oldest son, David, he was born in 1950, June 27th, 1950. I had longed for the day when I would become a mother. And both your father and I were so thrilled to have this little baby boy in our life. And he grew up to be such a fine, good man. He's married. I don't know if I say this in the to him directly or what, but David lives in Kansas City with his wife Kathy. They have 2 girls, and he is a grandpa. I have 4 beautiful great-grandchildren. Angie has Cole and Olivia, and Valerie has Gretchen and CJ. I love you all dearly. You mean so much to me, and you have been such great comfort to me. My son Gary. Gary was born on September 1st, Labor Day, 1952. He's probably the one that gave me the most the most gray hair, if I would have had it, when he was growing up, because Gary was and still is a person of great joy. he again was wanted so badly and meant so much to us when he was born with his golden hair and his big blue eyes and wonderful temperament, just a happy, happy child. And he was a happy baby, he was a happy child, he was a happy, devilish teenager. He was all good things to his dad and I, to his aunts who loved him dearly. His aunts loved all three of my children. But he was the one who was around the most. He is married to my beautiful daughter-in-law, Karen, and they have three gorgeous daughters. There's Laura, who lives in Austin. She is a social worker, terribly proud of what she has accomplished. Jennifer, who lives in Chicago, and she works in the fashion industry, and she too is a joy. And Annie, who is, well, I'm going to give you their ages too. Laura was born in July 24th, 1989. Jennifer was 1950, November the 9th, and Annie, February 6th, 1985. Annie is a teacher. She lives in Omaha. She is our delight. She is precious, and all the girls, all five of them are wonderful and have great meaning in our lives and have been so good through trial and tribulation. They have been there, and I love you all with all my heart. Know that your dad loves you and always will. Okay, now, Tommy, your turn. You were supposed to be the girl. But believe me, nobody was disappointed when you came in 1955. My story about you is that when I was first pregnant, in about the third month or so, the doctor said that I was probably going to have twins because I was growing at an enormously great rate, and that usually indicated twins. And I thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I'm going to go from 2 boys to now to 4. I didn't know you were a boy at the time, but I thought, 2 kids to 4 kids, how am I going to do this? Well, I got so used to the idea that when in about my 7th month, when the doctor said, well, twins usually come early, so we're going to have to do an x-ray. Yes, in those days they did x-rays. And there was just one long baby. I was so disappointed I cried for 2 days because my 4th child was not there. But you more than made up for it by being you. You're my exceptional son who has always been someone I could rely on. I rely on your advice to this day, don't I? I call you when I need some advice because you have a very level head. You're your father's son for sure. You've got such a level head on your shoulders, and you're such a good person. And Tom is married to my beautiful daughter-in-law, Diane. And they do not have a family, but they have a kitty named Chloe that they love dearly. And of course, we, being cat lovers in our family, accept Chloe with all our hearts. You're good people, and that's all we've ever wanted to do, was raise good people. And I'm really proud to say that we did raise good people. They're fine, and they're civically conscious. They're loving. They're good husbands. I don't think we can ask for anything more than that.